Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Caroline Jean Fernald. I'm the Executive Director of Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, a partnership of 4 public-serving museums where our mission is to connect collections and research at Harvard with global audiences, fostering community, and deepening appreciation for science, the natural world, human cultures, and our shared experiences. With this mission in mind, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, co-sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East and Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Rune Nyord, Associate Professor and Chair of the Art History Department at Emory University, who will examine interpretations of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, which are now known to have been shaped by the Christian expectations of early Egyptologists. HMSC's partnership of museums crosses many disciplines, and we host a wide array of events throughout the year at our 4 museums. On March 25th, we will host Jean-Jacques Houblon, professor at the Collège de France and emeritus professor at the Max Planck Society for the 2026 Hallam L. Movius Jr. Lecture Series. Dr. Houblon will share the complex story of the arrival of Homo sapiens to mid-latitude Eurasia and the eventual disappearance of Neanderthals. On April 2nd, Oswaldo Chinchilla Mazariegos, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Yale University, will join us to share 3 decades of research on the ancient cities of Guatemala's Pacific coast. And on April 9th, we will welcome Joe Bagley, the Director of Archaeology for the City of Boston. He will discuss archaeological research on the Battle of Bunker Hill and the lost forts of Roxbury that is deepening our understanding of Boston's role in the American Revolution. To learn more about additional upcoming museum events, I invite you to visit our website, hmsc.harvard.edu, where you can sign up for our newsletter, or you can also follow us on social media. We are grateful to all of our members and supporters for making these programs possible. I will now turn it over to Peter Dermanuelian, Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology and Director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and a big greeting to all of our friends watching online as well. Always a big crowd. We're delighted about that. We almost made it to 2 days of summer, didn't we? But we only got yesterday. Oh well, it's could be a lot worse. So hopefully there will not be snow on Friday night, which is also forecast. Dr. Rune Nyord is Associate Professor of Ancient Egyptian Art and Archaeology at Emory University, where he also serves as Chair of the Art History Department. Before joining Emory, he held positions at the University of Copenhagen, University of Cambridge, and the Freie Universität in Berlin. His research focuses on ancient Egyptian rituals, and especially the ways that they are enshrined and reflected in funerary culture. This work involves not only analysis of the ancient ritual, visual, and material sources, but also critical engagement with the history of the discipline of Egyptology, which has led to funerary evidence being interpreted along very particular lines with a complicated relationship to ancient evidence. He's the author of some really groundbreaking monographs, which I heartily encourage you to take a look at. They are really tremendous. One is Breathing Flesh, Conceptions of the Body in the Ancient Egyptian Coffin Texts, Copenhagen 2009. Seeing Perfection, Ancient Egyptian Images Beyond Representation, 2020. And then most recently, and one that we covered in class just last year, Yearning for Immortality, the European Invention of the Ancient Egyptian Afterlife, 2025. His current work explores new ways of reading and viewing the ancient Egyptian recitations for coming forth by day, or more commonly known as the Book of the Dead. His new approach sidesteps traditional understandings of the work as a straightforward guidebook to the afterlife and recentering the contemporary social and religious contexts of these important inscriptions. So if the Egyptian afterlife has a future, Dr. Nyord is the one to describe it for us. Please welcome him.
Thanks so much for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out today. We know the story by heart. The ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife of trials and tribulations, not least the famed judgment of the soul, where the eternal fate of the deceased was determined. If the judgment was positive, the soul would be admitted to a paradisiac existence in a divine realm, but if it was negative, it would be consigned to eternal damnation. The idea is compelling and intuitive, and it supports the comforting notion that the modern yearning for immortality is a universal human phenomenon being traceable all the way back to Egypt. The narrative thus clearly serves a purpose for us, but is it also an accurate reflection of what the ancient Egyptians thought? If we examine the history and empirical basis of the model, the answer is most likely no. To begin with, we can note that the general characterization I just gave, an afterlife of trials and the judgment of the soul to determine its eternal fate, sounds remarkably similar to Christian ideas. Some details are even particularly typical of popular beliefs of the early to mid-19th century, which happens to be exactly the time when the hieroglyphs were deciphered and ancient Egyptian texts began to be translated. This in itself would be something of a coincidence. But even more worryingly, it's very difficult to find pharaonic sources that express anything like this model in a direct way. If we were asked to provide evidence for these alleged Egyptian beliefs, we would probably turn to material like this. Here, we would say, we see the very judgment of the soul with the heart of the deceased, the seat of conscience, being weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of truth, justice, or simply what is right. The depiction of the act of balancing is incontrovertible, but the meta-narrative of judgment and eternal rewards and punishment, salvation and damnation, is provided by us. Readers of the text often accompanying this vignette, known conventionally as chapters 30b and 125 of the Book of the Dead, might be forgiven for feeling a little perplexed. The former of these recitations presents the idea of an unruly heart that needs to be brought under control, which was accomplished ritually by the notional replacement of the heart by a perfected stone form, the so-called heart scarab. Chapter 125, on the other hand, is concerned with the ritual purity of the speaker. The text explicitly ends with a triumphant declaration, "I am pure," repeated 4 times. This is established by reciting a litany of transgressions that the speaker has not committed, from very general ones, such as committing murder, to much more specific violations of cultic or administrative rules. If forced into the mold of the salvation narrative I mentioned, these ideas can be seen as local details fleshing out the judgment, salvation, and damnation pipeline. The heart might speak out against its owner during the Last Judgment, and the so-called negative confession are a series of universal ethical rules, the transgression of which would lead to damnation. But this is our meta-narrative, not something the texts actually say or even imply. If we ask for concrete pharaonic evidence that this is how the Egyptians did in fact understand the text and images, rather than assuming it from the outset, we tend to come up short. On the one hand, then, the ancient Egyptian afterlife framework is suspiciously similar to popular Christian beliefs of the 19th century. On the other, we can only find support for it in the Egyptian sources if we assume it from the outset. This problem stands at the center of my recent book, Yearning for Immortality, which poses the question of how ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs ended up being so profoundly shaped by Christian ideas and expectations. A key finding is that this happened well before the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, so that the early readers of Egyptian texts came in with very strong and entrenched expectations about the Egyptians believing in an afterlife with judgment, salvation, and damnation. And further, that one could assume this to be described in a straightforward fashion in compositions like the Book of the Dead. There's no need to follow these historical developments in detail for present purposes, but a few examples might be helpful for seeing how such strong expectations could be formed before the Egyptian text could even be read, and why these expectations continued to prevail in the face of increasing knowledge. In 1737, almost 100 years before Champollion's decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822, antiquarian Alexander Gordon studied the imagery on a coffin in a private British collection. Classical sources like Herodotus and Diodorus had by this time been read and interpreted in ways that strongly suggested beliefs in afterlife judgment with rewards and punishments. Gordon bolstered these ideas further by drawing on more general Greek ideas about post-mortem judgment, understanding these Greek ideas to have been derived from originally Egyptian ones, as well as Neoplatonic authors discussing ontological good and evil principles. he arrives at the following interpretation of the weighing of the heart scene on the coffin. The two figures by the balance perhaps may symbolize the opposite good and bad principles. These seem each, by pulling the scales down towards their own side, to claim, as it were, the soul of the deceased for its own. The balance symbolizing that after the actions of the deceased are, as it were, weighed, the hierogrammateus, or sacred scribe already mentioned, enumerates them before Pluto, the supreme judge of the shades, that he may pass sentence on the deceased, who seems, as it were, led in by the Agatha demon before his tribunal already described. End quote. Apart from a few minor details, the overall interpretation of the scene has scarcely changed over the last almost 3 centuries. What is remarkable about this interpretation is that it cannot have been derived solely from the classical sources, but rather draws clearly on the Christian iconography of St. Michael weighing the souls at the Last Judgment, emphasizing the conceptual proximity between the Egyptian and Christian judgment. Greek ideas of psychostasis, or weighing of the soul, are very different. So details such as the weighing of souls as post-mortem judgment, and especially the notion of good and evil forces competing to claim the soul, can only have been derived from Christian iconography, even if Gordon does not mention this inspiration explicitly. At Gordon's time, scenes from the Book of the Dead were not widely known, but this changed in the early decades of the 19th century with the publication of the Description de l'Égypte. If anything, the prevalence of weighing scenes in such manuscripts confirmed to scholars that they represented what was assumed to be a central idea in Egyptian dogma. The presence in papyrus manuscripts, also containing numerous other scenes that might appear less immediately legible, led to the reasonable hypothesis that such manuscripts constituted a kind of guidebook for the dead. This in turn was highly convenient for modern scholars who were particularly interested in what the Egyptian afterlife actually looked like. Together, this made for a highly attractive set of expectations that carried over once the text began to be translated. In the slide, we see how Jomard, chief editor of the Description, first identifies the weighing scene as a judgment and then moves on to read the following images as a narrative sequence of events experienced by the dead in the afterlife. Still, let us recall, without being able to read any of the texts. In the meantime, ideas about the Christian afterlife had changed during the 18th and early 19th century to increasingly focus on post-mortem journeys, trials leading to spiritual betterment, and lengthy processes before finally arriving at the situation in which eternity was to be spent. Prior to the early 18th century, such ideas had been largely absent from dominant Christian thought. Think of famous examples of static and abstract afterlife landscapes like those of Dante's Divine Comedy or Milton's Paradise Lost. The Book of the Dead seemingly fitted extremely well with these newer expectations, with its depictions of the deceased soul seemingly moving from place to place, encountering different beings, and even carrying out agricultural activities. But once again, the expectations came from contemporary Christianity rather than from ancient Egyptian or even classical sources. As they became translated, the recitations preserved in the Book of the Dead turned out to be heavy on mythological and ritual allusions and generally rather opaque. But at least they did not directly contradict the overall model, even if they also did not provide a lot of new information pertaining to it. This is why the salvation meta-narrative became so important, as we saw in the case of the weighing of the heart vignette. The interpretation is less about what the text says and more about the modern narrative situating it within an overall model of judgment, salvation, and damnation. As this brief overview shows, studies of ancient Egyptian mortuary religion are at a crossroads. It's quite clear, both from the intellectual history I have briefly outlined and from a closer scrutiny of funerary texts and images, that the traditional model that I opened with is becoming increasingly suspect. Not only were its key features developed before anyone could read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but the model changed very little after the ancient sources were fitted into the model. In fact, the details of the model are difficult to find expressed in any direct way in pharaonic sources. This raises two general questions that will guide the rest of our exploration today. The first question concerns what the ancient Egyptians actually thought happened after death. If the kind of personal afterlife with judgment, salvation, and eternal life that we usually assume is not actually found in the sources, what do the ancient sources tell us about death and the dead? The second question is complementary. If the Book of the Dead and other funerary compositions do not describe the afterlife in any straightforward way, how can we understand the strange words and images the Egyptians placed in tombs? We have a wealth of information about ancient Egyptian conceptions of death and the dead that is relatively easy to understand and has a number of cross-cultural parallels from other times and places. This evidence is quite well known to Egyptologists, but because it does not fit well with the meta-narrative of judgment, salvation, and so on, it tends to be disregarded or discussed briefly and separately in introductions to Egyptian mortuary religion. But let's see what happens when we take it at face value and center these clearly expressed ideas in our understanding, looking for the kind of things the Egyptians actually did with and said about the ancestors. We have copious evidence of this from tomb chapels and stelae to the so-called letters to the dead, where ancestors are addressed to solve specific problems for the living. This material has long caused unease for Egyptologists because it presents an image that is much more concrete and interactive than the transcendent afterlife that was assumed to be described in the funerary texts. In the tomb, we see the regular interaction between the living and the ancestors in the offering cult. We witness the busy lives in the funerary domains producing the offerings and see lists of the ritual presentations carried out at different festivals throughout the year. In the letters to the dead, we get a sense of an ancestor continuing to exist in the tomb who remains part of a social relationship to the living with new powers capable of healing, defending, or harming the living, but still part of a quid pro quo exchange of goods and services. Ancestors are vulnerable to living people entering their tombs in an impure state and frequently threaten to take vengeance on visitors violating the norms. Conversely, they can solicit voice offerings from passers-by in order to establish mutually beneficial relations with people that are not necessarily their descendants. Adjacent to the standard custom of family and household members presenting offerings at specific occasions, such negotiations provide important insight into how the ancestors were experienced in practice and what an ancestor could do. Through presence in their statues, ancestors can benefit from the rituals not just in the ancestor cult, but also in the divine cult when their images are set up in the local temple. Stelae and images depicting the ancestor were also set up in descendants' homes, indicating the pervasive presence of the ancestors in the lives of the living, going well beyond what might be implied by our notion of funerary culture. The overall picture is relatively clear, but we should be wary of the ways in which the conventional meta-narrative has encroached even on these well-attested concepts and practices. Thus, we'll often read that the purpose of the regular food offerings was to make sure that the dead could be sustained through eternity. This is not an idea that is actually expressed in Egyptian sources, but rather one which follows the meta-narrative. If the Egyptians were fundamentally after salvation and eternal life, as had been assumed long before the ancestor cult became known in any detail, and they seem empirically to have been occupied with giving offerings, it seemed to follow logically that the offerings must have served the purpose of attaining eternal life. Tomb inscriptions and letters to the dead do not imply this idea. Rather, the ancient texts focus on the offering cult as one side of the social interaction and maintenance of the relationship between the living and the dead, with no implication of a connection to ideas of salvation or eternal life. It is also important to note that very similar offerings were made to the gods, where modern intuition would not apply the meta-narrative of sustaining eternal life in a transcendent realm. The offering cult seems to have been neither more nor less than the standard way the Egyptians maintained relations to other than human entities of the cosmos, whether gods or ancestors. It was not that the Egyptians didn't think at all about what it was like to be an ancestor. One letter seen here begins by asking a female ancestor, "Is the West welcoming you as you desire?" A recurring theme is whether the ancestors know what is going on in the society of the living. There is a general expectation that the ancestors keep abreast of situations of concern, but clearly also an idea that sometimes they may need to be made explicitly aware through the medium of a letter. Another particularly harrowing letter from a widower to his deceased wife even seems to question whether she is able to receive the message of the letter itself at all. But despite such concerns with the practical realities of being an ancestor, clearly this is a far cry from the kind of detailed sensorial journeys through tests and trials and the beyond that we've been apt to imagine since the 19th century. This picture of the ancestors and their relations to the living, the gods, and the cosmos is rich, nuanced, and changing over time. However, the material briefly surveyed here leaves little room for the kind of 19th century transcendent afterlife that has usually been assumed as a complementary and largely unrelated system, seemingly attested only in the funerary texts. This is why we should be careful how we pose the question of ancient Egyptian mortuary religion. Clearly, the dead continued to exist in very important and tangible ways that we could in principle refer to as an afterlife. But since we have a tendency to mean by this a particular set of beliefs in a concrete otherworldly place where the dead go and continue to do and experience things, even asking what the Egyptians believed about the afterlife can actually get us started with the wrong kind of associations. But if we do want to talk about an ancient Egyptian afterlife, this would be it. The deceased being transformed into ancestors and joining their forebears in the necropolis. Here they would be visited regularly by their living descendants to celebrate special festivals throughout the year and receive regular offerings. Note that at this level of abstraction, the description could be true of a great number of other societies through history and around the world. Rather than being a special case of a culture morbidly preoccupied with death or a seemingly anachronistic precursor to Victorian Christianity, ancient Egypt becomes neither more nor less than a society in which the cult of the ancestors plays a central role in religious and daily life, similar to many other cultures, for example, elsewhere in Africa or in East Asia. We have arrived at this model of the Egyptian ancestor cult by sidestepping the vast body of so-called funerary texts, which are usually taken to provide a direct description of a transcendent afterlife of trials and tribulations. We saw in the first part of this lecture why this reading of texts like the Book of the Dead is problematic, but that raises another big question. How should we read such texts, and what role did they play in Egyptian funerary culture if the intuitive reading as afterlife guidebooks has turned out to be unrealistic? This is the question that will occupy us for the rest of this lecture. As we saw in the beginning, it was the images of the so-called Book of the Dead that first attracted the attention of early scholars and led them to the idea that the composition presented a sort of guidebook to the beyond. There were a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, an afterlife of journeys and tests was increasingly expected by the early to mid-19th century. So finding something that looked like this contemporary idea in an ancient text was in itself of great interest. Secondly, modern image intuition strongly expected a series of images showing the same protagonist to be a sequential narrative. Just as is the case today, 19th century image practices in illustrated books and religious imagery made this idea of an underlying narrative almost impossible to resist. In the case of the Book of the Dead, this interpretation was no doubt bolstered by traditional religious uses of such narrative sequences, as seen, for example, in the Catholic devotional practice connected to the Stations of the Cross, showing 14 sequential scenes from the Last Supper, or as here, the condemnation of Jesus by Pontius Pilate, to the placement in the tomb. As we'll see later, such a sequential narrative structure is only one possible, and not the most usual, principle in ancient Egyptian religious image practices. But before returning to the images of the Book of the Dead, it's worth thinking briefly about the history and origins of the tradition of Egyptian funerary texts. What can we say about the cultural context and indigenous understanding of this tradition if we sidestep the popular but specious notion that the texts conveniently describe what the Egyptians believed about the afterlife? The practice of inscribing ritual recitations in tombs goes back to King Wenes of the 5th dynasty, whose burial chambers were the first instantiation of what would become a millennia-long tradition. Some of the texts from his tomb are very transparently connected to rituals relating to the ancestor, most notably the recitations from the offering ritual, where short utterances interpreted or explained individual offerings traditionally presented in the cult. It seems very likely that these sayings were recited during the offering ceremony at the funeral, the later ancestor cult, or both. The idea of inscribing them in the tomb, in turn, seems to have been understood as a separate format for achieving the ritual effect. In a sense, the technology of inscribing a ritual text in a sacred space became an alternative medium for the performance of the ritual, and one which had the advantages of, 1, being permanent, and 2, helping shape the sacred space around the deceased. If this is relatively clear in the case of the offering ceremony, it must be admitted that the ritual background of many of the other texts in the royal pyramids of the Old Kingdom remains rather less clear. However, from their format and content, there's little to contradict the idea that all of the texts are ritual recitations that seem to be derived from a variety of religious domains. From the king's funeral to daily life rites of protection against snakes and other dangerous creatures, with temple rituals and the ancestor cult being other likely original settings for part of the inscriptions. It seems to be true of the other rituals as well, that the inscription of the recitation serves to render the performance of the ritual and its effect of permanent benefit to the king. An important corollary of this that has only come into mainstream Egyptology fairly recently is that we cannot read these ritual recitations as descriptions of the afterlife in any straightforward sense. This is so, firstly, because they come from a variety of social contexts, some of which may have had nothing to do with death from the outset. But secondly, and more importantly, ritual recitations rarely present the kind of dogmatic beliefs that early scholars were after, as they draw on mythology and cosmology in free and elusive ways. This led early, and often also more recent, scholars to an impression that a lot of contradictory beliefs were apparently mixed together in the texts. But it is clear today that this impression was the effect of reading the texts in ways that simply did not correspond to their contents. Scholars were after the exposition of dogmatic afterlife beliefs, but they sought it in texts that were focused on efficacious uses of mythology and to some extent might not even have had anything to do with death from the outset. As noted, this realization is still in its infancy in Egyptological scholarship, and its consequences remain to be fully explored. Here's a formulation of this problem by Oxford Egyptologist Mark Smith. Quote, "One key to understanding the pyramid text is to realize that they are ritual texts. They are not expositions of ancient Egyptian theology or descriptions of what the Egyptians thought the afterlife would be like. They may contain elements of such expositions or descriptions, but providing these is not their primary purpose. The statements they contain are functional, designed to make things happen." End quote. Given the background of the text outlined here, this seems reasonable enough, yet some of the entailments appear counterintuitive. Surely, if a text in the pyramids say that the deceased king is Re and flies across the sky, it seems perfidious to claim that the Egyptians did not actually believe this. The point can be clarified by looking at Egyptian ritual texts in other contexts, some of which are likely similar to the kind of situation some of the funerary texts were derived from. The text seen here comes from a compendium of recitations for healing and protecting mothers and young children during and after childbirth. This particular passage is, as the heading informs us, for removing blisters from the body of a child. "You are Horus, for you have awakened as Horus. You are the living Horus, as I remove the illness which is in your body and the suffering which is in your limbs." This recitation, like many other similar ones, uses the mythological situation of the young Horus who was protected by his mother Isis from a variety of dangers when he grew up in the Delta marshes in hiding from his murderous uncle Seth. The mythological situation is not just something that happened a long time ago, but is a general pattern of life and death which can be applied to affect the outcome of real-life situations. The text is not, then, a statement about a belief concerning what will happen to any specific human, but it is a pattern that can be deployed to anyone in a situation where it will be applicable. There's no sense that this is a dogmatic belief, such as the Egyptians believed that when a child got blisters, they became horrors. However, if we had happened to find this text in a tomb, that is exactly how the conventional reading of funerary text would have us read it, as a literal statement about divine transformation and bodily reconstitution. In other words, reading the funerary texts as ritual recitations means not stopping at the surface level and just quoting the text as an example of an exotic afterlife belief. Rather, we need to think about what mythological patterns are applied and to what effect, and whether the text shows any clues to what its original context might have been. During the early history of the tradition of funerary texts, such inscriptions were largely without pictorial illustration. The increasingly systematic addition of images is a key feature of the Book of the Dead. As we saw, they were a significant reason why scholars have been led astray to think of the work as a sequential narrative, which would be quite unlikely given what we've said about the nature of funerary texts as ritual anthologies. How then can we understand the addition of images to the tradition of funerary texts? One of the first things that strike us in looking at any illustrated Book of the Dead manuscript is the prevalence of one particular motif, namely that of the owner of the scroll in a gesture of worship. To early scholars, that simply indicated something the dead would be doing in the afterlife, and with no one to contradict that idea, it stuck. But what might the implications of this motif have been for the indigenous viewers and users? Here as well, a bit of historical background will be useful. During the Old and most of the Middle Kingdom, scenes of non-royal people worshipping the gods are absent from the monuments. Scholars have suggested that this is because, in one sense or another, non-royals were not allowed to worship the gods, but that seems unrealistic. It is more likely the result of a sense of what was appropriate to show in private monuments. It's not that it didn't happen, but rather that it would not be pertinent to depict. We see the first break with this tradition in monuments set up at the Upper Egyptian site of Abydos. This was regarded as the burial place of the god Osiris, and it became a place of pilgrimage, especially during the Middle Kingdom. Many people who traveled there set up shrines and stelae commemorating their participation in the rituals for Osiris. Given the connection of that god to death and burial, it is natural that such monuments borrowed many of their conventions and contents from funerary monuments, though most such visitors were not actually buried at Abydos. On the most immediately understandable level, stelae like this one thus commemorated an actual act of worship. When looking at the stela, later visitors would be reminded of an act that had taken place some time in the past. However, because the shrines and stelae were set up along the processional route by which the statue of Osiris was carried out of the temple towards his tomb at the recurring festivals, the image of the worshipper gains an additional function. Through his image, the stela's commissioner remains at the site and worships the god in effigy whenever he passes by in procession. In other words, setting up and dedicating an image of oneself as a worshipper comes in itself to count as an act of worship. The image does what it depicts. At Abydos, it seems likely that in order to set up the image in the first place, the commissioner probably did in fact travel to Abydos and participated in the rituals. However, in the logic of the image, that is actually not necessary for it to fulfill its function. As the dedication of the image counts in itself as an act of worship, it is not actually dependent on being a depiction of a real event, as we might have intuitively expected. One could in principle make such images of oneself as a worshipper of gods one had never actually worshipped in the flesh, and it would still count as an act of devotion to that deity. This potential for an independent use of the image becomes important for understanding the use of images in the Book of the Dead. It is also completely parallel to our observations about the function of recitations in the funerary texts more broadly. Just as the inscription of a recitation in a tomb can count as a permanent instance of the performance of the ritual in question, so the depiction of oneself worshipping a deity can be understood as granting a permanent role as worshipper. As noted earlier, such scenes of worship are the most common motif in the Book of the Dead vignettes. There is evidence of a systematic development of images to accompany existing recitations during the early phases of the Book of the Dead, and it seems the worshipping scene was something of a default option where no other obvious way of illustrating a recitation's contents presented themselves. In some cases, it seems to be little more than a way of visualizing the speech situation in the text. Certainly, we find the owner in acts of worshipping major gods, as in the case illustrated here, but we also see worship of a number of minor deities, such as guardians of gates, and even elements of the owner's own personhood, such as the heart or the car. In all cases, the logic is relational. Just as the Abydos stela served to make the owner a permanent worshipper of Osiris, the Book of the Dead vignettes serve, along with the accompanying recitations, to establish permanent relationships to various elements of the divine pantheon and the cosmos. While the worship scenes are by far the most frequent, we do find a number of other relationships enshrined in the vignettes, including more passive roles of the owner as object of funerary rituals or recipient of offerings. However, the underlying relational logic appears to be much the same. Note in particular that the juxtaposition of such scenes in a single manuscript, for the most part, do not show signs of implying any chronology or narrative format. Some recitations seem to cluster together because of shared themes or origins, but during the first several centuries of the history of the Book of the Dead, the order and selection of individual recitations is extremely fluid. Even once manuscripts become more standardized during the first millennium BCE, there is little indication that the Egyptians thought of the juxtaposition as anything like a narrative sequence. From what we've said about the function of such images in Egyptian culture, we can see why the narrative reading, as intuitive as it is for modern viewers, is fundamentally a misunderstanding of how Egyptian religious images tended to work. What happens when we read the Book of the Dead according to these principles? And more specifically, what, if anything, can it tell us about our initial question concerning Egyptian mortuary religion more generally? As we've seen, the tradition of ancient Egyptian funerary texts does not consist of regularly updated guidebooks to the beyond. Rather, they form a heterogeneous collection of ritual texts, the inscription of which in the tomb chamber or on funerary objects effectively functions as a lasting performance of the ritual in question. Depending on the domain of life from which each recitation originated and the way it was seen as relevant in relation to an ancestor, the owner of the Book of the Dead can play a variety of roles. Some of the recitations are presented as being performed for the ancestor and correspondingly addressed to them, but in the Book of the Dead, the majority of the recitations present the owner as the speaker, which is what made the text seemingly fit quite well for early scholars into the idea of a narrative sequence of things to say when you are dead. As we saw, this basic idea of the owner performing ritual recitations also underlies the principle of illustrating the majority of the vignettes. It is not too much to say, then, that the Book of the Dead is centered around the idea of positing the owner as a ritualist, with a precise selection of rituals performed differing significantly, especially during the New Kingdom. But what does it mean that the recitations are derived from different domains of life? Firstly, how do we know? And secondly, how does that influence our understanding of the text and images? Some cases are quite straightforward. According to its instructions, the so-called Chapter 1 of the Book of the Dead is meant to be recited on the day of the burial. The accompanying vignette depicts the burial procession moving the deceased on a sled towards the tomb. In the text of this recitation, the owner presents himself in the guise of Thoth, stressing the many priestly and funerary services that deity carried out for the god Osiris. Against the background of this priestly authority, the end of the recitation has the speaker asked to join a collective of ancestors who receive offerings, a frequent relational way of conceptualizing the idea of the transformation into an ancestor. Dealing thus with the connection between priestly service and competence on the one hand, and the incorporation into the collective of ancestors on the other, the text is well suited for performance on the day of the burial, when this notional transition is actually taking place. It is also, subsequently, appropriate for frequent inclusion in the Book of the Dead, not because it describes beliefs about the afterlife in any straightforward sense, but because the Book of the Dead serves to enshrine and render permanent the effects of the rituals carried out at the funeral. If the funerary rites are the most obvious origin of recitations in the Book of the Dead, they're not the only one. Over recent decades, a number of scholars have identified different recitations that likely originated from the temple cult. The identification of such rituals usually hinges on overt similarity or parallels in recitations known to have been used in temples, instructions preserved in the Book of the Dead indicating performance in the temple cult, or the use of the Book of the Dead text or their accompanying images for decorating actual temple walls, or some combination of these criteria. A good example of this comes from chapter 137b, a recitation accompanying the ritual lighting of a torch. This text occurs in a number of variants, but some of them are very close in wording to recitations known from the so-called daily temple ritual, where a flame is lit by a priest as part of the preparatory acts before the daily offerings are presented to the deity in the temple. The recitation is meant to be spoken by the ritualist lighting the flame, but the heading indicates that this is a ritual carried out for, rather than by, the owner of the Book of the Dead. In other words, while chapter 1 presented the ancestor as speaking on his own behalf, chapter 137b belongs to a group of texts that present the ancestor as the beneficiary, basically in a role analogous to the deity being worshipped in the temple, rather than that of the priest carrying out the ritual. This once again highlights the lack of an overarching scheme uniting all chapters of the Book of the Dead, as well as the fact that the role assigned to the owner differs depending on the origins and relevance of the ritual. The text makes mention of the Eye of Horus, which is the traditional identification of any offering gift in Egyptian rituals, whether for gods or the dead. Here as well, this is simply the text recited on the occasion of the ritual, not a literal description of the deceased traveling in the afterlife and being given the actual Eye of Horus. Another very pertinent origin for recitations is the ongoing ancestor cult, carried out at regular intervals following the funeral. The rites, and particularly the offerings performed in the ancestor cult, are often closely similar to those of the funeral. This makes sense because the funeral was the institution of the new status of the deceased as an ancestor, and thus the first occasion on which ancestor offerings were presented. On the one hand, this can make it difficult in individual cases to pin down whether a recitation stems from the funeral, the ancestor cult, or both, but on the other, it means that it wouldn't change our understanding of the rite significantly. As was the case with recitations from the temple cult, the evidence for an origin of a recitation in the ancestor cult can come from a variety of places. One fairly straightforward type of evidence comes from the instructions accompanying Book of the Dead recitations, for example, in chapter 133, where the rubric reads, "Book for enabling an ancestor performed on the new moon festival." The idea of an able ancestor is one who can make a difference in the world, in particular to help descendants in a variety of ways, as we saw earlier. Enabling an ancestor, then, means to keep the ancestor in this state of being able, and it makes sense that this would need to be done periodically. In the specific case of Book of the Dead, chapter 133, the reference to the New Moon Festival tells us that this particular recitation was meant to be performed on a monthly basis at the beginning of the lunar month, a date of traditional significance in the ancestor cult. It is the reference to this date and its indication of a periodic performance that shows us in this case that the recitation had its setting in the ancestor cult rather than at the funeral. As is standard in the Book of the Dead, the recitation is presented as being spoken by the owner, although he proceeds to speak of himself in the third person. This finds its explanation in the instructions, where it turns out that the ritual was performed in practice by reciting the text over an image of the ancestor in the company of the sun god, as shown in the vignette to the recitation. In this case, we thus find a hybrid situation in which the ancestor ostensibly carries out a ritual in his own ancestor cult. This creates a closed circuit that aligns well with the technology of the funerary text, where the inscription and image function as a permanent equivalent to the periodical repetition of the ritual in the ancestor cult, as we've seen. The last major ritual setting that Book of the Dead chapters are derived from is private rituals for healing and protection. Here as well, there are various types of indications of connections to this domain. One such indication is when Book of the Dead chapters are found as part of compendiums of such rituals. Thus, the so-called papyrus Chester BT 8 contains a number of recitations for protecting living humans against a variety of ills. One of these ritual recitations is identical to Book of the Dead chapter 18, a text where Thoth is asked to make the voice of the ancestor right against his enemies among various groups of gods. In the Book of the Dead, this has traditionally been understood to be directly related to the idea of the judgment of the dead, where the deceased is justified, but the occurrence in a compendium for protecting the living makes this unlikely. Rather, the notion of enemies is a frequent designation of hauntings, disease, and other threats to the thriving of human life. While in the Book of the Dead version, the name of the owner of each individual manuscript is inserted throughout, by contrast, the Chester Beatty Handbook leaves the designation so-and-so in all of these places, so that the performer would be able to insert the name of the beneficiary during recitation. In this case, it is perhaps less obvious that the healing ritual should be the original context for the recitation, but at least it was seen as relevant in both spheres, once again mitigating against an interpretation of the text as a literal description of the afterlife, let alone one connected to the final judgment in the beyond. Let us return briefly to the afterlife depiction par excellence, the famous weighing of the heart vignette against the background developed here. The vignette clearly shows the balancing of the heart against an emblem of Ma'at, along with the induction of the owner by the gods Anubis and Horus. But what do the texts indicate about ritual backgrounds along the lines outlined here? As mentioned in the beginning, the vignette tends to be accompanied either by chapter 30b or chapter 125. We already noted that neither of these texts line up in any direct way with the conventional reading of the weighing of the heart as the last judgment. Chapter 30b belongs to a group of recitations concerning the danger that the owner might lose control of their heart, specifically conceived as speaking against the owner in the presence of a group of gods. The motif of retaining control over parts of the body, including what we would term mental faculties, belongs to the broader theme of bodily perfection and reconstitution, and the heart recitations significantly predate the notion of the weighing of the heart. As the chapter is often found on heart scarabs, it seems rather clear that the recitation should be connected with a part of the funerary rituals when the heart is perfected and made right. Judging from the vignette and indirect evidence such as the weight of actual heart scarabs, we may speculate that this perfection was effected ritually by actually balancing the heart scarab against the figure of Ma'at prior to being made part of the embalmed body, but that remains conjectural. The other text connected to the weighing of the heart, chapter 125, presents the Declaration of Innocence, where the speaker makes 42 statements of transgressions that they have not performed. This invited early parallels to codified lists of transgressions like the Ten Commandments, but here as well, if we follow the indigenous evidence, a rather different picture emerges. Declarations of innocence consisting of a series of utterances of the format, "I have not done this or that transgression," are known from a Greek translation of oaths spoken by priests to be initiated from the 2nd century CE. Similar litanies are found at doorways leading to the internal parts of temples in the Ptolemaic era, where they detail the purity description for entering the sacred space. Most recently, similar recitations have been identified in the so-called Book of the Temple, a work known in multiple copies and detailing ritual concerns in the temple cult. While all this material is later than the earliest occurrence of Book of the Dead, chapter 125, it seems relatively clear that the genre of the Declaration of Innocence was associated not with ethical post-mortem judgment, but with the establishment of purity, and thus ritual competence of a candidate for entry into a sacred space. This correlates with details of the text and vignette. In the vignette, we see precisely the admittance of the owner into the shrine of Osiris, and the text in fact ends with a proclamation, "I am pure," repeated 4 times, as mentioned. Here as well, a ritual understanding not only allows us to sidestep anachronistic concepts of judgment and salvation, but helps us understand additional details. It is time to return to our initial question and to the title of the lecture. What does the future of the ancient Egyptian afterlife look like? As we've seen, the conventional narrative of judgment, salvation, and eternal life largely came out of the expectations of early scholars and was not adjusted fundamentally after the decipherment of hieroglyphs and the growing familiarity with other Egyptian evidence during the 19th and 20th centuries. Sidestepping these expectations turned out not only to be entirely possible, but also to offer new exciting possibilities for the research of ancient Egyptian mortuary religion and funerary culture. First, we saw robust evidence of what kind of afterlife the Egyptians explicitly talked about. The transformed ancestor dwelling in the necropolis, where they were interacted with on a regular basis to sustain the mutually beneficial relationship between the dead and the living. The living performed regular rituals to maintain the presence and beneficence of the ancestors, who in turn would secure health, fertility, and general thriving of their descendants and wider households. Text and archaeologically attested practices show the concern with regular rituals, purity requirements, as well as efforts to ward off hostile dead. This complex of ideas has begun to attract renewed attention in recent years, as scholars have increasingly become interested in how religion was actually experienced and practiced, rather than focusing on reconstructing dogmatic beliefs. The line of argument I've presented today moves the ancestor cult from being a somewhat marginal set of practices to lying at the very center of the ancient Egyptian conceptions of the afterlife, if we want to continue speaking of that. This points to exciting new research directions on what people actually did in and around tombs as part of their individual lived experience, rather than as merely a pale reflection of universal dogmatic beliefs. A traditional aspect of the ancient Egyptian afterlife that can be rethought even more fundamentally in future research is the reading of the funerary literature. As we've seen, the idea of these compositions as direct descriptions of what would happen in the afterlife has certainly been convenient for modern scholars interested in just that question. However, this strategy of reading the text is unlikely to reflect indigenous understandings. Instead, future research will likely focus increasingly on reading the text as ritual recitations that for the most part saw active use in other social domains prior to or alongside being included in the Book of the Dead. As we saw in the examples, these outside contexts can be of significant importance to understanding the role of the text and images in the Book of the Dead, especially during the current phase when we are still getting used to the idea of a ritual reading of the texts. In both of these domains, it seems likely that we'll be seeing research shifting away from traditional concerns emerging over the coming years. For anyone interested in this topic, there's thus much to look forward to concerning the future of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. Thank you very much for your attention.